Hello, everyone, and welcome. So today we're going to be talking about human population growth as well as population biology. So this is a pretty timely um, lecture because it ties directly into what you're going to be examining for your lab on Thursday when you head to a cemetery or you head to a website to scour the internet for cemetery records. So I really like this quote by Wilbur Zielinski. He's an author and a geographer, and I like to start us off with this. And he says, "The problem that shakes our confidence in the perpetuation and enrichment of civilized human existence, or even our biological survival, is that of growth, the rate, volume, and kinds of growth, and whether they can be controlled in an intelligent, purposeful fashion." And what he's really getting at is sustainability. Controlled in an intelligent, purposeful fashion is sustainability. Using your resources in a way that they're going to be there for future generations to grow the same way previous generations were able to grow. And it's just a sort of a little cartoon where we have the increase of human population in billions. We were here in the 2000s. You may not want to be here in 2050 when we're there. But as you'll see, the sort of estimates on how far we're going to go up this curve do vary. So what is a population? And a population is simply a group of the same species living in a defined area. And that defined area can be a small area like this beach. We have all these seals living, or it could be the planet, right? The human population or the global population of humans or seals or whatever we want to talk about. So that's a population. And again, it's a set of individuals of the same species living in the same region or habitat. And in terms of how we define a species in terms of biology, the most basic definition of a species level is simply can or can they not mate with one another and produce a viable offspring. And the offspring has to be viable in the sense that it can give birth or can impregnate another individual in the next generation. Um, so this is what we call the biological species concept. And an example of how this sort of falls apart, for example, how this sort of doesn't work and how it sort of reinforces it is the liger, or you could think of a mule, right? In this case, we have a tiger and a lion mating and they're producing offspring, the liger. But the liger itself is sterile. It's not able to essentially produce viable offspring for the next generation. So which makes a lion and a tiger a distinct overall species. Though I do always like the liger because it's just its head is so tiger-like and it's got this little mini lion mane. But I digress. So this gets into this idea of population structure. What is it determined by? So it's determined by a couple different factors. Sex, though, does vary. So sex is kind of a complicated thing in nature. It's not male female as you'd expect. There's sort of can be this weird gradient in some species, and there can be flopping back and forth. So sex is kind of a difficult thing to determine. This is followed by age. This can be sort of how old you are. So what we would call a cohort. So like say 10 to 15 years old or 20 to 30 years old. You can also look at the age at which individuals die and the number of individuals per age class. We can look at size, so how much biomass or physical living material you have for a given organism. This is better for plants when we're thinking about plants, how much biomass we have in a given forest. And all these things sort of come together to link in terms of how things are born, how things die, and how things move. And it all depends on these interacting factors of sex, age, as well as size categories. And so in terms of how populations themselves grow, it is a balance between that birth and death rate, right? At the most simple way you think about anything growing, whether it's a population, where you think it's your stock portfolio, where you think it's your own personal wealth, right? It grows by what's coming in and what's coming out. But in the case of a population, it's what goes in and what comes out, in the sense of what is born and what dies. That's the ultimate balance between how a population sustains or expands or contracts its overall population. Now, we can use mathematical models to describe a population and how it changes all the time. These include variables such as birth rate and the death rate, as I mentioned. And the birth rate and the death rate can vary depending on how things vary or potentially a almost a 600% growth rate here. So you can use a model to describe how things are going to grow. But ultimately, without some sort of overall environmental limits, a population will reach what we call its maximum per capita rate of increase, or R, or it's what we call its biotic potential. And so the idea of this R is essentially how much population you can physically produce given unlimited resources. So, sort of thinking about this with something like a mouse, if you gave mice unlimited resources, they would reproduce extremely fast over a very short period of time, but eventually they can only produce so many offspring at a given time. The only types of organisms that sort of don't hit this type of curve in a reasonable fashion is actually microorganisms. They grow super duper fast. They don't seem to have an overall limit on how fast they can grow given a sustained period of time. But just as a note. So we can look at the increase in population. If it's exponential, we call this the J curve because it looks like, again, a J. And these are species that have very high biotic potential, such as mice, such as dandelions, spotted knapweed. These are the examples that are given here. But more importantly, things that are biotic in nature, so living, such as loss of predators or abundant resources, can also result in exponential growth in organisms that usually don't experience these J curves. So exponential growth can't last forever, and this makes sense on many levels, right? You can't have exponential growth in populations forever. There's only so much resources, but this is true for any growth of anything whatsoever. The economy can't grow exponentially forever, right? Nothing can grow exponentially forever because there's an upper limit. In terms of populations can't grow forever because resources ultimately become scarce. And resources, when you're thinking about things in nature, it's food, water, and space. Those are the three things that matter the most. And, those are pretty similar to, what limits human population growth as well. Ultimately, individuals starve or are unable to find habitat for reproduction. This leads to aggression, competition, disease, and increase of all sorts of different factors that we like to call density dependence. And this is going to come in just a moment. We'll talk about this. But as you increase your population, in addition, you also experience pressure from predation. So if you have more mice in a given area, well, you're going to have more predators of mice. And so population size does increase while the growth rate is decreasing, is what we call logistic growth, or an S-shaped curve. So we have this S-shaped curve in contrast to the J curve. So these all tie back to this tan line here, or brown line here. It's called the carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is simply the population size that can be sustained indefinitely, so forever, by the resources available without any long-term damage to the environment. Now remember, animals don't really do, tragedy of the commons. They are limited by their resources. They don't try to sort of overshoot themselves in the same way that humans do. So the carrying capacity is really something that does heavily keep individuals in check. And sort of the interesting thing about carrying capacity depends on typically growth factors and how much resources you need to survive and reproduce. And the carrying capacity can increase or decrease depending on how much those resources change over time. And just before we move on to the next slide, just to highlight the difference here between the J curve, again, that exponential growth exponential growth rate, and the S curve. And the S curve is much more common for what we see for the vast majority of species on this planet. Even those that sort of follow the J curve, it eventually starts to look like an S curve because eventually they just run out of resources and they eventually have to plateau. So let's talk about how we limit population growth. What are some of the growth factors here that limit how high a population grows? So the first step of these are what we call density-dependent factors. So these increase as populations grow, and these include disease, competition, as well as predation. And sort of the interesting thing about these is when you think about density-independent factor, it's all about how compact you put animals or any individual in a given confined space. Because as you increase the density of individuals, you increase the amount of predators or the potential to be eaten by a predator. You increase the spread of disease. And I think that's pretty well known from COVID. Places that have very dense population had a very rapid spread of COVID-19. You can think of New York City, Los Angeles, very rapid spread because the population is so dense. And then finally, competition, not just competition within a herd. In the case of, we have reindeer here, but it can also be competition with other species. So as you physically increase the amount of biomass, the amount of living material in a given space, you're simply going to increase the amount of density-dependent factors. And there's a lot of sort of interesting other genetic aspects I should mention before I move on about density-dependent factors at the genetic level that come into effect. So if you're really interested in this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but take a peek at the allele effect. It's a really interesting way of how the genetics influence how density-dependent factors influence population size. Next up to this is going to be the density-independent factors, and these will affect the population regardless of its size, but do ultimately serve as a check on population size and population growth rate. And these are typically, what people in the insurance industry would call like God events, or acts of God. These are just random, irregular occurrences that are typically as a result of nature. These include storms, large fires or floods, avalanches, and any other natural disaster you can think of. That is a density-independent factor. But ultimately, these two types of factors will affect different types of species differently. And so we have two very distinct classes of species in nature. We have R-selected and K-selected, or R-adapted and K-adapted species. So we're going to talk about the first type of species first. So this is our R-adapted species. And the really common sort of known R-adapted species is actually the mouse. And the really commonly known K-adapted species, as we'll talk about, is actually an elephant. So whenever you think about this, mice are the R, elephants are the K. But these have a very high rate of population increase, so they're typically going to follow that exponential curve, and they are typically well adapted to exploit unpredictable environments, and they will increase very rapidly in population size as more and more resources become available. So you can think of these oftentimes as very weedy things. So dandelions, mice, pests, rats, spotted knapweed is a great example, but anything that will sort of move in at the sort of slightest hint of a resource being available. So if you have a crack in your sidewalk, dandelions or any other weedy plant will move in almost immediately once they see that available space. And our R-adapted species have some interesting characteristics, including typically a very short life cycle, very rapid growth, very early maturity, and producing very many but very small overall offspring. And these offspring get very little or no parental care. And as I mentioned with the sort of the crack in the concrete, that's a very unstable environment. And most of these sort of species that are adapted are well adapted to unstable environments, such as, disturbed fields or post-forest fire things like that. They're typically prey, and they're typically what we call niche generalists. And a niche is simply the entire width of ecological sort of bandwidth an organism experiences. So it's habitat, it's food, it's nutrient acquisition, anything you could think of that you're doing, that's what we call a niche. And something that's a niche generalist is basically something that can exploit many different resources. So it can eat many different types of seeds or food types and things like that. So those are our adapted species. Our next up, as I mentioned, is our K-adapted species. And these are the classic example of a K-adapted species is the elephant. But these individuals overall have low reproductive rates, and they're very responsive to environmental conditions, and they do decrease or increase slowly as a result of resource availability changes. And so the examples we have here are very large trees, bears, elk, so very large animals. They have typically characterized by having a very long life, slower growth, very late maturity, very few but larger offspring with a much higher investment of parental care. They're more adapted to stable environments and don't do well in fluctuating environments or disturbed environments. And they are typically predators, and they're typically, again, niche specialists. So that means they generally specialize on one thing. So you can think of like something like a bear, which is a great example of a K-selected species. It specializes on a certain group of foods. It's not just eating anything it finds, it's not eating tree bark or anything like that, but it eats a very sort of small number of things, and it doesn't really branch out from those things. But as I mentioned, our K-selected species tend to be stable in undisturbed areas. So think of like pristine forests, nicely preserved parts of the ocean. And they typically have very slow increases and decreases in response to the environment. And that, again, that's in contrast to our selected species that have very rapid reproduction, very, very high population growth rates, very, very sort of short windows of population growth. But ultimately, a lot of the populations will ultimately level off near their carrying capacity, but some have the capacity to actually physically overshoot the carrying capacity. So let's look at what that looks like. So look at a case here of the deer mouse. They're increasing by their population size. So we have a carrying capacity of K. They heat the carrying capacity and they overshoot it and they ultimately crash. And why are they crashing? Well, they're simply running out of resources, right? Food, space, water. Those sort of the key tenets of being an animal. They crash and they go below the carrying capacity, but you see they rebound, right? And this is just a function of how fast they reproduce. As you saw from sort of the graphs of the J curve, you saw that that happens very fast, right? This exponential growth is very, very rapid, and it ramps up very, very rapid as well. So you can think about what happens if you have this sort of growth and you overshoot your carrying capacity, but what happens if you don't bounce back? What happens when nothing overall survives? Well, I'd like to talk about a specific example about this. This is actually the reindeer. And so we're going to use an example that was in Alaska. And so in the 1940s, they transported 29 reindeer to St. Matthews Island in Alaska. In 1957, they documented 1,300 reindeer. In 1963, they documented 6,000 reindeer. But 3 years later, they documented only 4 reindeer. And by the time 1980 rolled around, they had 0 reindeer. And this is what their growth rate looks like. Very, sort of normal. This sort of looks like a logistic growth. And then bam, they take off exponentially in a very short period of time. They overshoot that K, that estimated carrying capacity here, and then they crash hard, eventually going locally extinct from this island. So what caused this to happen? Well, it's a really, really interesting interplay of density-dependent and density-independent factors. So the reindeer on the island were heavily reliant on lichen, which are these symbiosis between algae and fungus. You see them everywhere. So when you go to Bentley's campus one day, you'll see them on like rocks. They sort of look like like green or gray or sometimes yellow smudges on rocks. That's a lichen. But in more pristine areas, lichen look much more like this. They look much more plant-like. Now it's sort of interesting. The reindeer were heavily reliant on this very abundant food source. But it was interesting. When their population started to crash, they experienced some pretty heavy snowstorms. And these pretty heavy snowstorms ultimately shut down these lichen. And when you shut down the lichen, well, you shut down the population growth. And eventually, if that shutdown of lichen is long enough, you shut down the population as a whole. So again, it's the play of density-dependent and density-independent factors. A snowstorm caused a resource to become very scarce, which caused the population decline. So again, it's interplay between the two factors here. And so sort of just moving on from this idea of how populations are limited, we should talk a little bit about survivorship curves. And so depending on what type of species you are, you typically experience one of these 3 different types of survivorship curves, type 1, 2, or 3. So type 1 is where we fall into. So mortality or death occurs at a very old age. And you have slow reproduction and these are typically our large case selected animals. So you can see humans, not a lot of people die. So this is number of survivors out of 1,000. And you can see, not very many people die, in old to, young, mid to sort of young ages here, but then people start pretty heavily perishing at very old ages. That's in contrast to type 2, where mortality has no relationship to age dependence. It's constant. This is pretty common in birds. This is pretty common in fish. It's pretty common in reptiles as well. You just sort of have a steady decline over time. The probability of dying up here is equal to dying down here as well. And then finally, we have our R selected species. These have very early mortality, and so you can see you have very high population at first, and then a lot of people die I shouldn't say people, a lot of individuals die very quickly, and very few live to be to old age. So this is characteristic of our selected species, but it's also pretty common with fish. So for instance, the salmon every year, very high mortality early on, with very few living to adulthood to survive and reproduce. So this is how populations change. This is the carrying capacity. This is survivorship curves. So where do humans stand? Well, we're at about 7.4 to 7.5 billion people. We add about 85 million people every year. In 2050, right now, we actually expect it to hit about 9.7 billion people. And And just as a note, before I just make a note about this 9.7 billion people, most of this growth does occur in low and middle income countries. So you're thinking, Africa, Southeast Asia, things like that. Sort of an interesting thing about this 9.7 billion people is that this is the best estimate as of recent, but actually because of both the perceived threat of future pandemics as well as the sort of growing socioeconomical divide in sort of across the world, not just here in the United States, but across the world, we actually expect just because of poverty rates and hunger rates of starvation getting higher, we actually don't expect to hit 9.7 billion people anymore. We actually project it to be closer to 8.5 billion, maybe 9 billion, but certainly not close to 10 billion anymore. But we'll see. Part of human population growth, as we talked about with the Anthropocene, is technology. So maybe our technology will allow us to sort of escape or maybe get higher than even this. It's actually kind of interesting. If you looked at this number a couple decades ago, people were estimating 12 billion. So it has been revised quite a bit in recent years. So we're thinking about how populations change at the global level. Global level, again, is that balance between birth and death, right? The only way you can add more people to this planet is by having more people be born than die, right? That's the global scale. But we're thinking about a population at the country level. It is a balance again between those births and deaths, but it's also a balance between immigration and immigration, right? How many people are coming in from other countries and how many people are leaving the United States for other countries. And so that's what we're thinking about at the local level as well. And sort of this interesting factor about human population density. So you can look at this map of the United States and you can look at the same map of any country in the world and you get pretty much the same sort of layout. And I hope you notice right away that our density, which is again, population density here is just defined by the size of the peak here. You'll notice that every state kind of has a peak, or sometimes multiple peaks in the case of, say, New York or California or Florida or Texas, right? There's lots of peaks, and you'll notice there's lots and lots of flat areas. I think Nevada is the best example here, right? It's pretty much all flat except for Las Vegas, and then Reno over here, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm not a geographer, so don't ask. But you notice that populations are heavily confined to cities, and depending on which country you go to, population density in cities can be 50%, they could be 60%, they can be upwards of 90%. It just depends. But here in the United States, it's about 50% of people live in cities, 50% of people don't live in cities. And the other thing I hope you notice from this graph is that things are really concentrated around heavy bodies of water, large bodies of water, I should say. So the ocean and the Great Lakes. Water means commerce, means trade, means lots of resources from the ocean. So this pattern of lots of population cities, lots of populations near the coast is pretty common. And as I mentioned, about 50% of the world's population lives in cities. And actually, if you look at the density of populations near the ocean, about 50% of the population of the planet lives within 100 kilometers of the ocean. So we love to live in cities. We love to live in the ocean. When we span this up to be globally, again, you see the same patterns, right? Pockets in cities, heavy along the coast, very sort of sparse and very dry areas like the Sahara or the Gobi, a little bit in this American Southwest, in the Atacama Desert here, and Australia is basically one giant desert as well. And you see the only population in Australia is pretty much here. That's actually kind of interesting about Australia. This little slice here along the coast has more population than the rest of Australia combined. Just a fun fact. But again, that density is city as well as in the coast. But you can also see countries like India and China where you buck that trend, right? You have these huge population densities here in India and China that are not really quite near the coast. They are city, but again, not near the coast. And we can actually look at the age structure of a human population. So there's 3 different classes we're going to look at here. So you have an expanding population, a stable population, and then a declining population. And we have categories. So we have pre-reproductive, 0 to 14, reproductive, 15 to 44, and post-reproductive, 45 and older. So you can see when we have a population that's expanding, we have relatively equal number of males and females, and that's true across all 3. Globally, there is slightly more males than females, but it's not by a huge amount at all. It's like 1% or something like that. And so in terms of the structure of an expanding population, you have lots and lots of young children that are being born, right? And you have lots of people in their reproductive years producing lots of children, and you still have a decent amount of people in their old age, but not a ton. A stable population has a sort of a nice balance between all sort of three categories. We have old people, young people, and lots of young people, and lots of very young people as well. And then a declining population, again, has a sort of the opposite, right? It's pretty top heavy. Most of the population is concentrated in the older folk, some reproductive age, but very, very few children being born overall. And we can just sort of give you some real world examples of this, where we have rapid growth in Nigeria, very, very few old folks, lots and lots of young folk. We have slow growth in the United States, where we have, again, a pretty sizable older class, pretty big chunk of, the sort of the middle-aged people, and, a decent-sized chunk of the young folk as well. And then we have a declining population in Germany, where it's pretty much the same all the way across. And the sort of the interesting thing about some of these countries is, as I mentioned, most of the population growth of the planet right now happens in relatively poor areas of the world, such as Nigeria. So really rapid population growth here. Slow growth, where we're seeing here in the United States, or declining growth, again, is typically in much more affluent countries overall. And a lot of the times in these countries, what's sort of keeping them from rapidly declining, in the case of the United States, is actually lots of immigration. So we have lots of immigration here in the United States. Overall, it's a good thing for our population because it keeps us from being in decline like Germany. So just as a note. So as I mentioned, we are still expanding our population. We're still adding 85 million people every year. And the question you should ask yourself is, how long can the human population keep growing? So I mentioned we're expected to plateau probably closer to this 8.5 million. Previous estimates were 10 billion. Some people previously estimated 16 billion, but people tend to think that was pretty optimistic and pretty heavily reliant on technology to get us there. But how long can we keep growing? And it's multiple factors did attribute to the rise of the human population and how fast we're growing. I hope you sort of look at this and realize this is the J curve, right? We're on that exponential trend. We haven't hit our carrying capacity yet. We're not entering that logistic growth, right? As a global population, certain parts have already hit that carrying capacity, but globally, not quite yet. So as we've mentioned when we talked about the Anthropocene, many factors such as technology, so the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution allowed us to have access to medicine, food and resources, and expand our population and distribution into areas that we wouldn't be able to do before. So very dry areas or very cold areas. And death rates overall dropped. This was because of things like vaccination, better sanitation, and overall healthcare. And so we have a lot of technology. That's what keeps humans going. And what we think we can grow indefinitely is through technology. If you have good enough technology to grow food, for disease, for waste management, in theory, you could grow the human population indefinitely. But again, when we're thinking about growth, indefinitely, it should be not at the cost of our natural resources. The human population growth rate has slowed since the 60s, but again, it's still growing at about 1.2% a year. As we mentioned, population growth is unevenly distributed. 96% of those 85 million I mentioned were born in developing countries, so those are doing less well off economically. And in the population growth in less developed countries is typically 14 times higher than in more developed countries. In addition, we are, again, as we mentioned, people are being pretty heavily urbanized. So people have moved from rural to urban areas for mostly economic opportunities, right? There's not a whole lot of space in the agricultural world. But ultimately, our capacity to expand, again, is directly tied to technology, but it is tied to nature, right? We are directly dependent on those ecosystem services: air filtration, water filtration, disease suppression, resources. We're dependent on all those things. And so we do have this potential to reach an ecological tipping point. What do I mean by an ecological tipping point? Well, an ecological tipping point is where you damage nature too much that even if you took all the pressure off nature, it still wouldn't bounce back in a timely manner. So it's long-lasting damage, long-term changes, and which would lead to sharp declines in populations, not only of natural things, but also the humans, and potentially, as we've seen with COVID, the reemergence of the plague. And it depends sort of your perspective on this, right? And if you look at anyone who's an analyst on this idea, the problem is sort of multifaceted, right? Large and quickly growing populations in developing countries, overconsumption in affluent and more developed countries, and sort of this idea that technology has allowed us to overcome the environmental limits faced by other species. But this sort of gets us to this question: is do we slow population growth or reduce resource use, or do we do both? Right? How do we sort of keep growing human population, or how do we stabilize it? And so with that out of the way, let's talk about what you're going to be doing for your lab. So we're going to be calculating, or I shouldn't say we, I should say you are going to be calculating a life table, and you're going to be calculating a survivability curve. So let's talk about how we do that. So life tables are used to summarize how mortality occurs in a population. Are they high among juveniles, other groups, what's going on? Or do older organisms die more than younger organisms? So how can we establish this population structure? It gets us our age structure as well as our sex structure. And so there is a technical definition for this if you are interested. So what types of parameters should we throw into a life history? And when we say life history, it's simply referring to what sort of what you've done in your past. That's sort of really what a life history is, but you got to think about it as like a population level. So there's a couple things that go into this. So we have X, which is the age of the individual. We have N sub X, which is the number of individuals of age X. L to the X, which is the number or percentage of individuals that are alive at age X, i.e. survival. And we have BX, which is the fecundity rate, thinking about reproductive rate. We can think about this as the average number of female offspring produced per female per time period. And ultimately, we can look at a relationship between these. So we can look at LX times BX, which is the number of offspring per individual and at each age class, or we can look at LX times BX times X, which is the age-weighted fecundity. And so what you're going to be doing for your lab is calculating a age survivorship curve, that L of X. So what you're going to be looking at is binning your data into age classes, so 0 to 9, 10 to 19. You can do it at 5-year increments if you so chose, but the easiest way to do it is in 10-year increments. For each increment, you want to look at how many deaths you have and the number of survivors you have, and you calculate the proportion surviving by simply dividing overall. You take how many total population you have, which would be the sum of these two columns, and you divide it by you subtract it, proportion surviving, so it's percentage. So you divide the sum of these two columns by the I should say you divide the number of survivors by the sum of these two columns. That gives you your proportion surviving. And to get your proportion surviving out of 1,000, you simply multiply this column by 1,000. So that you get a percentage here. So it's 100% times 1,000 gives you 1,000. And then you take the log of that. And what you're end up plotting is this number, this log of the survivorship as the y-axis, and age class. This one it's months, but years it'll be bins. So this will be age class 1, age class 2, and this is what you'll get. So you get a survivorship curve that looks a little bit like that. And so we can sort of look at what this looks like. So the age class in months, the number per age class, survival rate, fecundity, offspring, age-weighted fecundity. You can calculate all these things again, but what you're really looking for in your lab today is getting a table, no, I shouldn't say today, for this week is getting a table like this to calculate a curve like this. And remember, when you read the lab, you're trying to answer, is there different survivability curves between two distinct groups of individuals? And you could have two distinct groups of individuals, either, between males and females, between the 1700s and the 1800s. You can between, single people and divorced people. You can sort of parse it out by looking at if they have a spouse in the records there. There's any number of questions you can ask. You could potentially use if you could find race information, you could do, African Americans versus white, or Chinese versus white. You can do any number of things, but ultimately this is the table you're looking at to calculate your survivorship curve. And there is math that goes into it, but the simple way is just to think about it into this table. And as I mentioned, this will be your cemetery lab. So review the handout on Blackboard. Thursday, in theory, you should be collecting data at a cemetery of your choice or virtually with your group. You are working as a group. You're going to complete your tables, create your figures, basically 2 survivorship curves, one between group A you're examining and the other between group B that you're examining. Answer the questions on the lab handout as a group, turn it in as a group, and that's it. I do want each person for the group to turn in a copy, just so that it's easier for me to grade. I'll